Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. I can see more and more of you are joining, so I will just run through some housekeeping before we kick off. Today's webinar is called Air Quality Projects, and I realised that this is a bit of a misnomer because from what I've seen and seeing, most projects are now air quality projects. And hopefully you'll see that through some of our discussion today. The plan for today, we have 4 presentations from practitioners, including myself, who have been involved in transport and air quality projects and delivered them on street for local authorities over the last few years. And then we will have a good session for Q&A and a panel discussion. We're going to run the introductions today. So my name is Nick, and I'm the Director of Environment at Marston Holdings. I'll be your chair and one of your expert speakers. Then next up, we've got Faith. Faith is a colleague of mine. We've worked together for many years, and Faith is an engagement expert. So she'll be talking to us about engaging with communities around air quality. Sarah, another colleague, who will be taking us through cargo bikes and e-cargo bikes, one of the many solutions we have available to ourselves. Finally, we've got Harley. Harley is an air quality consultant and will be taking us through the final expert presentation this morning. Right, so some housekeeping then. So if you've got any questions, please pop them in the Q&A section of the webinar rather than the chat section. That will help us to be able to track them, and we hopefully will get through them all during the session. If not, we will give you written answers to any that we don't cover off in this session. This session will be recorded, and Landor will be posting it on YouTube later this week, hopefully. And I think that's it for my housekeeping. I've probably forgotten some, but if I do, I will. I'm sure Landor will tell me. So that all said and done, let's crack on with the presentations. And I do believe I'm first. Chair's prerogative, no doubt. And so as I said, my name's Nick, and next slide, please. And I work for Marston Holdings, of which Project Centre and Vortex are part of our organisation. And I always start with a little bit about me. I did have my original slide for this. I had a test tube and a bike because I wanted to get across I was a chemist and a transport planner, but it looked pretty boring. So I chose these pictures instead. So on the right is me working very hard at my London Borough during the Olympics 11 years ago. And on the left is the main reason why I am so passionate about environmental matters, air quality, decarbonisation. That's me and my son out for a walk in the park. Next slide, please. So you've all seen this one before, Public Health England slide on the impacts of air pollution throughout our life and how air quality affects us. And then there's new research all the time, every week, every month. I'm seeing new research, new evidence on the negative health impacts of poor air quality, right from birth to old age. Next slide, please, Barath. Oh, I think there's some bits missing on that. Can you pop them up? There we go. So all local authorities have statutory air quality monitoring and reporting duty. Now, they do that mostly in 2 ways, and the 2 ways there are on the left. Diffusion tubes and reference stations, one very, very expensive, one very cheap. Both have pros and cons. What they do give us is super cool plots like the one on this slide here. But what does it really mean to residents and businesses in an area? This is my local authority. They have 2 reference stations, as you can see, and we get lots of data out of these reference stations. But it doesn't really tell me what's happening on my street or what route I should take to school to breathe cleaner air. Next slide, please. And this is where hyperlocal monitoring comes in. Now, I call this project monitoring rather than hyperlocal monitoring. And for me, projects can be anything: clean air zones, low emission zones, school streets, LTNs, active travel, electric vehicle, parking projects. we in the UK have a mature transport network in that we don't build much new infrastructure. So our projects tend to be around tinkering with layouts of infrastructure, changing pricing models and access to the network, and behaviour change schemes. Now, clean air zones, low emission zones, both behaviour change at their heart, and they're designed for us to get drivers to get rid of our polluting older vehicles using a range of carrots and sticks. And more projects are having to be justified both formally and locally, and evaluated on environmental grounds, and air quality and decarbonisation are just to name a few. And project monitoring can provide an accurate evidence base to secure project funding. It can provide transitional context during the implementation of a project, and it can provide you with defendable evaluation data. Now, this thing here, you see the little white box there, the black one, that is our technology, our vortex air monitors, and these are designed for dense local deployment and really strong community involvement, and also to create a base for more IoT devices as new technology is developed and implemented at a local level. Next slide, please. So how does it all work? Now, this is really cool and quite a simple diagram actually from a colleague of mine, Ella, who designed it for a new startup. And what we see is we implement multiple heads, these heads up on lamp columns around a project to collect pollution data. Now, these columns are pretty closely located, so we get a nice dense network, and all this data is shared in real time with the cloud. You can see the data going over to the cloud where it's processed, it's calibrated, it's optimized, and then it's pushed to your laptop in your office or your public portal if you're sharing this with the public. And it's that simple. Although I've been assured that the algorithms that power all this are anything but simple. Next slide, please. Right. So, and apart from some boxes on lamp columns, this is what you see, the public, the local authorities. Now, this is our customizable portal showing live data. This was about 5 a.m. this morning when I got up and finished this presentation. I was just looking at what was going on. And this one is around a school in Waltham Forest. You can see the heads there, 6 heads around a school. And on the right, you can see some of the data coming through. So what we've got NO2 seems to be dropping from midnight to about 5. And we've got lots of particulate spikes over the last 5 hours, which is interesting. And then overlaid with traffic data, with camera data, with weather data, this really becomes more than the sum of its parts, and even more powerful when it's shared with the public and explained to them what's going on and why and what we can do about it. Next slide, please. Final slide, I believe. So the last portal we saw was one of our case studies, which is on our website. All this details on our website, and it's a school street on the left there, enforced using our ANPR cameras and a whitelist. And it's a very successful school street, and it's very well received by the public. And the second case study we have, and you might see a theme here, is it's another school. And this one is to monitor the impact of softer behaviour change measures rather than harder engineering measures in the northwest of England. So we've got loads more of these on our website, vortexiot.com. We will be sharing the slides. This whole presentation is recorded. And I will leave you with a headline that I read recently from a new piece of research published in The Lancet. I think it was last week. And its headline was that less than 1% of the Earth has safe levels of air pollution. And that's me done. Thank you. Bharat, can you move on? So right now, I am really excited to introduce Faith. As I said, colleague of mine, Faith. She will be taking us through some of the work she's been doing, engaging with communities on air quality. Over to you, Faith.
Thanks, Nick. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I am having some microphone issues, so please shout if you can't. But I think it's all good. Right. Yeah, so Nick's already introduced me, so hi everyone. I won't introduce myself again. If you could go to the next slide, please. So just going to run through a project that we did last summer with Merton, London Borough of Merton, looking at air quality messaging for purposes of health and getting health messaging out there. So I'll run through a little bit of the background, you know, why we kind of went on board and helped them with this project, the objectives that we were given for it, and then what we actually did, and then the results. So yeah, next slide, please. So before we go through all that though, a bit of interaction, hopefully from people. Feel free to write in the chat if you don't want to speak, that's fine. But yeah, we're looking in this project at different apps, sources of information for air quality and air alerts. So I'm just interested to see where you all currently go for air quality information, whether you use any air alerts apps at all. So yeah, can you pop a few in the chat if you have any favorite websites or apps that you use? Sarah, Nick, Harley, etc. Feel free to play this as well. So we've got Kent Air, UK Air. Any more? It's meant to be quick, I won't spend too long on this. Air Quality England. Any more? Sorry, I won't make you all suffer for any longer. So yeah, just from that you can see there are so many different sources of information. Thank you, AirText. Apple Watch does it by magic, excellent. So yeah, many sources of information out there. I've just put a few on this slide that we discovered when we were looking into some background information for this project. So I think that's just to demonstrate how much information is already out there. This is just in the UK. There are many more, you know, if you start looking across Europe and further afield. We identified at least 18 different alert and monitoring apps, systems and websites at the start of this project. So it can be a little bit confusing and hard to know where to go for a single source of information. Next slide, please. So that was part of why Merton got us on board to work with them on this project. So they do a lot of air quality work in the borough and their neighbouring boroughs, but they wanted to have a look at the kind of appetite out there for combining all these different sources into one easy, hopefully, source of information for particularly for health professionals to use to help get public health and air quality messaging out across London in a clearer, more concise way. And so we were brought on board to engage with health professionals and then create a programme to roll out a potential service in the future. Next slide, please. So our objectives was mainly to engage with industry professionals and assess the need for a new system. So we were focusing on public health messaging, air quality messaging and government messaging in a way that we could just tie all these together and roll them into just one nice, neat system that people in London could use. And then the result of that would be creating a programme for rolling out a future service based on all of the feedback that we got. So at the time we were looking at things like public health messages around air quality, viral infections, because obviously COVID was still, you know, sort of prevalent. Well, and still messaging goes out by that, and then just other kind of preventative health measures that would tie in, especially for those suffering with any respiratory illnesses. Next slide, please. So we took a 5-stage approach to this. So just breaking down the stages here. So we started off with some information gathering. Obviously, you know, we were aware of a few of the sort of sources of information out there, but as I've said, there are many out there. So we took some time just kind of investigating what's out there, what it can provide, what information it hosts, how it can link into other things like apps and text messaging and things like that, and how it could potentially fit into a new system, especially tying in with public health messaging. So we were looking at things like, you know, what data is available currently in London, like from Breathe London, obviously from Vortex and other Marston partners, the GLA, DEFRA, all of those different sources. And then we put together a bit of a rating system based on how informative and easy they were to use and how well they could link in with other systems. So step 2 was then partner engagement. So the main bulk of this project was to engage with other boroughs, the Greater London Authority, public health professionals. We also talked to communications professionals just to understand what they would want of an air quality messaging service. It's all very well us saying this is what we're going to do, but we need to make sure it's obviously fit for purpose and works for what people want it to do, who the key partners were and what their objectives were, what sort of support they could provide and also they would need, and then having a little look at sort of public demand and what we thought that might be for the service. Next slide, please. Then we did some follow-up research, so mainly looking at similar systems in operation to try and predict the kind of public demand. And then we did some scoping of sort of IT opportunities and costs, obviously very important when you're looking at a service that you could potentially put into place. And then the final output, step 5, was going to be a project plan. Next slide, please. So what actually happened? So information gathering all went as planned. That was fine. Like I said, we identified over 18 different systems, and then put together a bit of a kind of matrix based on how well they worked and how informative they were, and how well they could kind of tie into other systems. And then the partner engagement, we ran some targeted online focus groups. Thought it was easier to do online than face-to-face just due to the kind of professionals that we were targeting, especially GPs, doctors, health professionals, very busy people, so it was a bit easier to find a slot where we could just meet in a Teams meeting. But yeah, we met with a few different groups, had targeted sessions so that we could ask specific questions because each user had slightly different needs, and then we assessed all of the responses and the conversations that we had in those sessions and tied them into the research step where we were looking at kind of what potential take-up could be. The scoping IT opportunities, probably not massively exciting, but yeah, really important to do. So the output of that was an appraisal matrix, which could be used for any new solution, alongside the sort of the costed factors. And then the project plan we did put together, but we changed the brief slightly based on the partner engagement. So the main thing to come out of that was actually that rather than having another messaging service, I think everyone felt that the information out there was great and it was actually really easy to use and gather messaging from. What was missing currently was a better way of filtering out and putting that messaging out there in a constructive and helpful way. So a lot of people were commenting that it's great having the air quality information, but then they didn't really know what to do with it. So they didn't know how to link that to actions people needed to take. Steps they needed to do. So as an action from that, we ended up putting together a toolkit that health professionals could use, and that would help them get their messaging out there in a more kind of concise and easy way on their different systems. Next slide, please. So this is what the toolkit sort of looks like. Sorry, it's a bit small. But yeah, the end output was a PDF document that we put together that had sort of step-by-step guidance for health professionals for putting messaging out to their users. So we were looking particularly at GP surgeries. We put together some suggested slides that they could put on their surgery screens while people were waiting for an appointment. I'm sure you've all been to a surgery and seen the sort of scrolling messages. So something active saying, if you're worried about air quality and the effects on your health, then please pick up a leaflet. We drafted a leaflet that again could be tailored and structured around the particular needs of the surgery. Some example roll-up banners, obviously, if they wanted to order them, put one in the corner of the surgery. And then as well, we put together some resources for SMS messaging, social media messaging, and other kind of formats they would like. So yeah, rather than just coming up with a planned sort of system approach, based on all the feedback that we got, we went for this toolkit approach instead, which sort of seemed like the more useful option. And then the next steps we're going to be looking at the rollout. So we haven't quite got that far, so I'll have to update you when we have done, let you know how it goes. But yeah, that's pretty much me, I think. Thank you.
Thanks, Faith. That was brilliant, and I was involved in that project and amazed at how many different systems there were out there, and some of the views on our public participants in that particular project as to what they thought around the various options that are out there and what it tells them about making changes to their own lifestyles. Right, thanks again, Faith. Now we move swiftly on to Sarah, who's going to talk to us about cargo bikes. Over to you, Sarah.
Hi all. As Nick said, I'm Sarah, so I'm a senior transport planner at Project Centre, and I'm going to run through some of my experiences managing and working on e-cargo bike projects, specifically relating to streamlining freight deliveries. Next slide, please. As I'm sure you're all aware, a shift to using e-cargo bikes has been proven to have a number of social, environmental and economic benefits. So just some of the benefits include low emissions, as e-cargo bikes have zero tailpipe emissions. They're financially cheaper, as there are significantly lower upfront costs compared to cars and vans. They also have lower running costs, cheaper insurance, maintenance and repair costs. A mode shift towards e-cargo bikes will also reduce any costs associated with PCNs. They also have the benefit of easing congestion and providing more efficient deliveries. So cargo bikes take up less road space, which eases congestion while increasing their efficiency. So the cargo bikes can take shorter, faster routes, and many cargo bikes use cycle lanes and can move through standstill traffic. So deliveries can also be made quicker, as the cargo bikes can be parked closer to the final destination than they could have been done if they were delivered by vans. So they also have the potential to reduce noise pollution, as they're not motorized and have no engine or heavy doors. They're typically quieter. The unloading does not require noisy equipment such as tail lifts or roll cages. And a final benefit is that it contributes to a healthier, happier workforce, as the physical activity of using a cargo bike and e-cargo bike is more beneficial for rider health. Next slide, please. So there has been a whole different range of approaches to implementing and trialing the use of e-cargo bikes. So case study research has shown there's no one typical size fits all approach to e-cargo bike use and implementation. So a couple of ways local authorities and business improvement districts have gone about implementing e-cargo bike schemes include implementing cargo and e-cargo bike freight consolidation hubs for last mile deliveries. So one of the ways of shifting towards more sustainable freight is by combining consolidation and management with these sustainable transport measures. So businesses which have consolidated deliveries, drawn up detailed management plans, and used e-cargo bikes for last mile deliveries have positively contributed to improved air quality and reduced congestion. So I think e-cargo bike freight hub schemes have been developed in lots of different forms within London, to my knowledge at least, and they've had high levels of success. So an alternative way of promoting cargo bikes is by actually providing a shared pool of e-cargo bikes for business use. So this can also include the loaning of bikes. So multiple business improvement districts and local authorities, they've actually purchased cargo bikes for shared business use. So in some instances, these bikes have been given to a cross-section of businesses, so to be used for their daily use, whereas in other schemes, they've provided shared bookable pool of bikes for businesses who want to kind of turn up and want to use the facilities. So they also have schemes which are for communities, so community cargo bikes and e-cargo bike schemes. So these tend to consist of a fleet of bikes to be used by residents, businesses and communities. They're often available for short-term loans and free of charge, just to kind of promote the use of e-cargo bikes. And then a fourth way that e-cargo bikes have been promoted is by subsidising the purchase of e-cargo bikes for businesses. So many local authorities and business improvement districts have offered subsidies for the cost of purchasing a bike, and incentives have also been put in place, so such as free 1 month cargo bike loans, and then once you've completed that month loan, you might have the opportunity to buy that bike at reduced rate afterwards, and also green carrier incentives. So there's a whole range of potential schemes by which e-cargo bikes can be introduced to businesses and local communities, and this is just a handful. So to my understanding, a lot of the time, the schemes have actually been undertaken alongside each other. So you might have a community cargo bike scheme alongside a freight hub, and this is kind of maximising the visibility of e-cargo bikes in a street in an area to showcase their potential. Next slide, please. So we undertook this extensive case study research to inform the development of an e-cargo bike freight hub for Leigh Street in the London Borough of Redbridge. So this scheme formed part of the GLA Business Low Emission Neighbourhood funding, and they required an investigation of an e-cargo bike freight hub due to the poor air quality along Leigh Street. So that was a brief. Our brief was to look into an e-cargo bike freight hub. But however, to build this case, there were many things we had to consider given the constraints of e-cargo bikes, the businesses and the location. So we first had to consider where the e-cargo bike freight hub could actually be located. So the maximum radius for e-cargo bikes to travel to and from a hub to businesses could not really be in excess of 3 to 5 miles. So that was kind of a constraint of where we could locate the hub. We also had to consider the proximity of the hub to the street road network, as we didn't want vans and polluting vehicles having to deviate significantly for their existing journey, especially through residential areas. So we also had to consider the type of goods which needed to be transported. So e-cargo bikes and cargo bikes had the capacity to carry out a number of deliveries and a range of different loads. So they had capabilities of up to 150 kilograms or 300 kilograms of trailers, as well as refrigeration cargo bikes. However, for general industrial businesses, while some outgoing services such as repairs and installation may be able to be taken by e-cargo bikes and potentially e-vans, not all the goods and services can necessarily be transported, and this would depend on the distance and weight of the goods being transported. So this is what we had to consider, which businesses were along there and what kind of types of goods and services they required to be transported. So the third one, which was key, was the business perception of e-cargo bikes. So the case study research has highlighted the importance of speaking to businesses, understanding their kind of views of e-cargo bikes and what they would use it for, and if they'd be interested. I think there's quite, the perception is changing, but I think there was a perception they are very expensive, they can't carry very much, and they wouldn't therefore be suited to their existing services and their deliveries. So we undertook in-person engagement and drew up a strategy to make sure we spoke to businesses about what we're proposing to do, the benefits, and whether they were keen to participate in a trial. So once we'd done that, we also looked at the potential services and suppliers. So consideration as to whether a third-party supplier would run the service was undertaken. So this has been seen in a lot of the case study examples, or we considered whether a shared e-cargo bike scheme, whereas businesses kind of drive themselves, would be undertaken. So there's a growing number of e-cargo bike companies offering last mile deliveries, and we undertook an assessment into the most appropriate supplier, given the context of Redbridge and Leigh Street and existing third-party facilities, as quite a few existing e-cargo bike freight hubs are actually located within e-cargo bike providers and their existing facilities. So we needed to see if there were any in the surrounding area which would fit our location requirements. And the final thing that we really had to consider was the restrictions in the area in which the scheme would operate. So it's vital to ensure that the route from the freight hub to the businesses could accommodate e-cargo bikes and cargo bikes safely. So as part of the Redbridge blend, cycle improvements were proposed. So this would ensure that Leigh Street would be able to accommodate the cargo bikes and sufficient parking facilities. However, we also had to consider the restrictions in the wider vicinity of the project. So all of these considerations helped shape the freight hub scheme for Redbridge and helped us with the optioneering and scheme development. Next slide, please. So as part of the assessments, we also drew up potential risks for e-cargo bike freight hub schemes and associated mitigation measures. So these risks and measures are solely really focused on consolidation freight hub schemes rather than the wider schemes, but I guess they are kind of transferable between different types. So a possible identified risk was the business impacts. So we had to consider that businesses may not want to actually change their practices and that we're resistant to change, especially with trading disruption following lockdown. So we sought very hard to engage with businesses at all different levels, especially in the very early stage before we fully developed the scheme to understand the interest and start the scheme as a trial. I think that was shown to be key in most of the case study examples, is starting off the trial, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, and then grow from there. Another risk is the employee impacts. So some employees may feel that their jobs are being replaced by third-party companies. So again, it was vital to talk to the businesses and ensure they actually understand the consequence of passing on the last mile deliveries and potentially work with them to choose the best provider and working with them. So because we were still at the optioneering stage, another risk was also the precise impacts of the scheme were unknown. So we had to learn from existing examples and understand how it's best to monitor and manage such schemes. A fourth risk that we identified was that it was difficult for a single centre to be able to handle a wide range of goods moving in and out of an urban area. So different goods and services have different handling and storage requirements. So again, as part of the engagement, we understood what kind of businesses were along Leigh Street, what kind of services and deliveries were required, and whether they would be suitable for freight hub deliveries. And then the final risk, which I've got here, is that some freight may already be consolidated. So much urban freight is actually already consolidated at the intra-company level or by parcel couriers. So limited benefits or sometimes even negative consequences could actually be undertaken by trying to channel these flows through a further consolidation centre. So again, it was just understanding from the businesses if there's any existing consolidation, how we could use that to either complement our scheme and how this would kind of work for the context of Leigh Street. So by being aware of the risks and overcoming them with good levels of engagement, the e-cargo bike freight schemes have potential to provide a plethora of air quality, congestion and social benefits. So I hope this has shown that there are a number of ways to introduce e-cargo bike schemes to streamline business deliveries. I just believe e-cargo bikes have so much potential, and it's great to see the growing amount of trials leading to full schemes which benefit society as a whole. Thanks.
Thanks, Sarah. Fabulous presentation. And another project I was involved in at the very outset, I think I recall pulling the funding submission for the initial work prior to COVID. So it's good to see the project coming to fruition. Right, just a quick reminder before our last presentation, do pop your questions in the question box that's accessible at the bottom. We've got a few coming through, so please do send them in for myself, for Faith, for Sarah, and for Harley. And on that, I welcome Harley as our last presentation. Over to you, Harley.
Brilliant. Can we just get started on the slides, please? So hi, everyone. My name's Harley Parfitt. I'm an air quality consultant. And what I wanted to talk to you today is about doing more with the monitoring data, and particularly focusing on kind of machine learning methods. Don't worry, it's not a how to, it's more like a why to, and the benefits of doing so. Next slide, please. So why did I choose this topic? So I've been working as an air quality consultant for the past 6 years. And during that period, I also took a master's in data science. So I feel like I've got a bit of a unique perspective to see how the meeting point of the two spheres. And so I wanted to talk about it today. And evidently, DEFRA has awarded many grants to local authorities who have put forward bids to undertake additional monitoring. And one thing I've noticed as part of my job as an air quality consultant is a lot of the local authority reporting does not make the most of the data. So these two figures on the right show the kind of the level of detail that some of these reports have. So for example, if you have an air quality monitor that will take a reading every hour, you'll have 8,760 in 1 year. However, it's often the case that all this data is just averaged to one number. So you can see in these one annual average, they call it, for a particular year. So that's an immense loss of information that could be used to understand how to reduce exposure. And this is linking, but often as this sort of monitoring is all to do with compliance and not what Nick referred to as kind of project monitoring, which is potentially to do with reducing exposure. And one thing I wanted to convey is machine learning need not be considered too scary. There are lots of easy ways to get into it, and you don't need to be a programmer or anything like that. Next slide, please. So one of the reasons why air quality and machine learning go hand in hand is because air quality data is incredibly noisy. And what I mean by that is that it's influenced by lots of different variables. So an air quality at one particular location is going to be influenced by the weather, whether it's windy, the wind direction, is it coming from a source of pollution, the time of day, the day of the week. So the weekend generally having lower concentrations than the rest of the weekdays. Is it a school holiday? And then you get into some more complex atmospheric chemistry and transboundary pollution events. So air quality data is noisy. And this graphic here to the right shows how concentrations of nitrogen dioxide vary between January and December at a random location I picked, had some data for a site in Hastings. So you can see on the y-axis is that concentrations fall as you get into summer, and they rise as you go into winter. Now, if you want to evaluate the impact of an intervention that occurred in July, simply looking at the before and after averages is not going to necessarily tell you whether your scheme was successful, because the main part, the biggest change in pollution may have been caused by weather. So what you need to do, you need to find out some sort of method to draw out the underlying trend. And machine learning is a really, really good way of doing this. It's a way in which the individual effect of parameters such as wind speed, wind direction, the air temperature, and any other variables you have data for can be drawn out to leave you with just the underlying trend. I think there's a one animation on this slide, so if you don't mind just clicking through. And there you might see that orange line that's just picked up or pinged up. That might be the underlying trend for your data. So next slide, please. So I would like to focus on a particular aspect of this, which we call metrological normalization. And really, it's a fancy name for asking your data set or asking a machine learning model to tell you, what would my data set look like if every day had normal weather? So, and I'm just going to talk through how you would how you do this. So in the top right hand corner, you have an extract of an air quality time series for a site in Chichester. So the column for NO2 gives you the concentration, and then the other columns give you the variables at the same time for wind speed, wind direction, and temperature. And if you just draw your eye to the Google Earth image, and I appreciate it's not very large, just to the southeast, of the monitor, there's a yellow dot showing where the automatic monitor or the monitor is located on this image. So you can feed in that data into an algorithm and ask it to tell you what variable has the greatest influence on measured concentrations. Now at this site, wind direction had the largest impact. And from these figures, it actually says that 42.1% of the variation could be explained by wind direction, sorry. And this is quite, this makes sense because the degrees of 200 to 300 refer to when the winds would be blowing from the road, and particularly the roundabout where emissions are higher. And then the other to wind speed, weekday, and air temperature. And once you've controlled for weather and potentially the weekday and the week, you're left with the underlying trend, which the model can't explain, and that is the underlying trend. And at this site, there's an evident decrease between 2015 and 2022, and that's in part caused by the vehicle fleet becoming cleaner. And there is a little dip in 2020 at the beginning of March, which we're going to cover in the next slide. So next slide, please. So have to talk about the COVID pandemic and lockdowns. So this graphic shows how pollution concentrations varied before and after the first lockdown. Now this was an extract from some work undertaken by air quality consultants. So each row represents a monitor. So there's little dashes on the y-axis of these figures, and that each represents the data, a time series for one monitor. There are 38 on this slide. So the red shows concentrations or period of time where the concentrations were above the 2020 average, and blue is where it's below the 2020 average. Now, if you look at if you just eyeball the figure, the left-hand side figure, sorry, and look at the ratio of blues to reds between before the start of the lockdown and after, you can perhaps see that there is a decline. It might be more blue on the right-hand side of the lockdown, but it's not evidently clear. Now, the right-hand side of this figure, so is where the data has been normalized. So it's the effect of weather and temperature, wind speed, and wind direction has been taken out. So that shows what the trend would have been like if every day was a normal day. And this shows a very, very clear distinction between the start of the lockdown, between the days before, where concentrations were above average, and after, where the concentrations were below average. And it's actually important because in the week preceding the first lockdown, there was a body of air that came from Europe, and had a lot of sites across England and the rest of the UK. Concentrations actually went up, despite there being a decrease in ground level emissions. Next slide, please. So what I just wanted to say to summarize is how you can make the most of your data, because I appreciate there are lots of there's just installing a network of monitors is not the end of the road. You need to undertake detailed analysis of the data to get the most of it. And one way I think is really important is that you try and integrate your data with your air quality data with different sources, be that with weather data, with traffic data, even simple data of knowing when school holidays are. And this is all information that you can take to understand how and why the changes in your air quality levels are happening. And it's really, really, really important to undertake baseline monitoring, because these models need to be trained on baseline data, and you also need to create a counterfactual to compare against. And just to finalize, these are some of the sort of questions that machine learning can help you answer. So I know that a lot of cases with the improvement of air quality, local authorities are looking to revoke their air quality management areas. And one of the key issues is they need to ask is whether this year, was it just a good year for air quality? Did the particular weather conditions mean that there was a good dispersion of pollution? And what is the likelihood of us returning to a year where there's poor air quality? You can create counterfactuals where you say, okay, weather was like this, or air quality levels were like this on one day. What would it have been like if weather was different? And particularly, if you just replace, so what was to say, with low traffic neighborhoods and other interventions that you put in, you can use the machine learning to clearly to show the trend. And yeah, that's me for today.
Start video. Thanks. Pardon me. Thanks, Ali. Fascinating stuff. I'm actually reading the Fear Index at the moment, a Robert Harris book around machine learning and Wall Street. So it does scare me a little bit, I must say. But I trust you when you say it's not scary and this stuff. Right, that's it for our panelists then. Can I welcome everybody back? Turn your cameras and your microphones on, and we'll run through some of the questions that are coming through. Please, everyone dialed in, do put your questions through. We've got probably about 45 minutes panel discussion, so I'll get through as many as I can during that time. And I'm going to start off with Sarah. Are you with us?
Yes, I'm here.
Yep, super. Sorry, I couldn't see you on my screen. I've got a couple of you actually to start us off with. One around the cost options of e-cargo bikes. How does an e-cargo bike stack up against an e-van, for example?
So in the project we were doing, we were looking kind of solely at e-cargo bikes. So the cost of e-cargo bikes seemed to be between 3 and 12 grand. That's kind of what that we were looking. So that would obviously depend if you wanted 2 wheels, 3 wheels, even 4 wheels, if you had trailers. So there's a whole range of costs to it, depending which kind of one would suit your business. I think with e-vans, there's a whole host of e-vans and a whole range of costs. So I don't know what the costs are explicitly, but I know an e-cargo bike is probably a lot cheaper. Yeah, it's significantly cheaper. But yeah, there's a whole range of, depends what kind of e-cargo bike you want for your scheme, but it's going to be a lot more affordable than a van.
3 to 12. No, that's great. Thanks. And what stay with you, Sarah. Another e-cargo bike question. What about insurance issues for staff? Did they get training?
So lack of standardized training is kind of one of the things that has been noticed kind of across e-cargo bike schemes. I know third parties like PedalMe, they have really rigorous cargo bike training courses, and that they're kind of trying to roll that out. In relation to if you have like a shared pool, it's kind of down to the discretion of the local authority. But with cycle providers, they're kind of growing their e-cargo bike training, so it's kind of be good to speak to them to see what they're doing. But I know that training is something they're really trying to push to get some more kind of standardized training, because as they grow, they're just going to get more and more popular. So we need to kind of know how they're best going to be trained.
Absolutely. No, that's great. Thanks for that, Sarah. Harley, got a question on PM 2.5 for you. You might be able to answer. So obviously, given the new legislation, and what options are there to monitor 2.5 and look at the health effects of 2.5 as well?
There we go. It was on mute. Well, thanks, Nick. Oh, thanks for asking that question. So there are two main ways, I guess, you could go down this, and I'll start with what Nick referred to as compliance monitoring, because I know that in a local authority I'm working with, they were installing a PM 2.5 monitor on their national network monitoring, and I know there is a lot more of that coming forward, where existing units are going to be retrofitted with PM 2.5 monitors to get your reference grade. But then there's obviously where sensors can be used to kind of fill the gaps in areas where you don't have such a comprehensive network. So they're very useful. And in terms of the health effects, I recently came across a really interesting website which explains that the average, if you're exposed to 23 micrograms per meter cubed of PM 2.5 a day, that's roughly equivalent to smoking 1 cigarette. And I thought it was a really useful way to convey, because everyone understands how bad smoking is for you. So having that kind of, if you live in an area, you can say, okay, I'm exposed to this, or my local monitor said this, average that over a year, so you can understand that you're living in this area is equivalent to smoking 300 cigarettes per year, for example. And that's quite scary, I think, to some people.
I think that contextualization is really important, isn't it, when we're talking to the public and politicians. I'm often doing carbon calculations and trying to contextualize the impact of carbon, and is it one flight to New York? But yeah, 1 cigarette, everyone knows that's bad, full stop, don't they? So yeah, I really like that way to sort of get over quite complex concepts. What is a microgram? What is a picogram? There's lots of scientific terminology that we use in the industry, isn't there, that people on the street don't need to understand or want to understand. They just want to know, tell me what it's like out there. Right, super. So right, moving on then. Do keep your questions coming in while we're chatting. Faith, talking about talking to the public, why is there so many different services just in one small country? And I know you didn't even look internationally, did you? There's lots more, but lots and lots of services that I'm guessing providing more or less the same thing. Yeah.
I think a lot of them, they are coming from just one or two sources of data. A lot are coming from, DEFRA's air quality data, or obviously in London you've got the GLA. So I think it's more that there are a lot of companies out there that are just trying to do different but competing things. And obviously there's kind of different companies that have different needs. So yeah, we came across the one when we were looking that kind of compares it to cigarettes. I was going to share it in my slide, but it's got a slightly rude name, so I didn't. But yeah, there's kind of companies out there that are trying to do stuff that is more technology based and is more for our kind of industry, I guess. And then there's the others that are trying to do the user friendly stuff. So I think it's just a case of like everyone developing things for different needs rather than having one consolidated service that just does it all, which I guess is what Merton had kind of identified as a potential issue, and we're looking at whether they could solve or not. But yeah, as I said, like the feedback was from our focus groups that actually people weren't particularly fussed about having all these different sources of data. It was fine, it was useful, but it was the output from them that wasn't necessarily as good as it could be, like the actual messaging it was just telling you air quality is bad in your area today, don't go outside, which isn't particularly helpful if you do have to go outside. So yeah, that was where the gap is what is actually helpful, useful actions and messaging that can be put out there that people can utilize.
Yeah, I recall those focus groups, or at least some of them that I was involved in, and it was you've got this data, you know that it's good or bad in contextualized terms. Then it was the messaging, wasn't it? What do you tell people? Do you tell people not to go out, or do you tell people not to drive? And I remember having those discussions with many professionals and different views on, you know, what is the instruction that we need to apply to an area now that we know what we know about the quality of the air locally. Yeah,
turning it more into sort of behaviour change rather than just a don't do this message.
Sure. And I have got one attendee asking if the health toolkit is available online. I do recall that Merton did want to share this wide and far, but we may type that offline, Adrian, and we'll get back to you.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So I suppose on the 2.5 question, I should have said that our monitors do monitor 2.5 as well as 10. So the low-cost monitors that are now on the market, most of them do monitor PM 2.5. So if you do have a particular project that's looking at that, there are now solutions that are available to implement locally. Certainly weren't the case when I was looking at local authority projects 10 years ago in my council. Right, I've had a question on cybersecurity, so I'll take this one because it's to do with our networks and our monitors, and the answer is and the question was around the accessibility and the protection of the data from hackers, and the way in which our particular solution works, it uses a mesh network, so it's a very secure network, and the platform we use, AWS, is very secure as well. So our solution is slightly different to others on the market in that we do use this mesh network rather than SIM cards to share data. So it differs, and again, you can hang other devices on it, but again, you've got the same level of security for the data. Again, this is not particularly sensitive data in terms of it's not personal data, but there's lots of levels of protection around the data that we're collecting, and most of our clients choose to share this one way or another with colleagues, with the public, with DEFRA, and each client seems to be different in how they want to do that and in what capacity. And I suppose touching on Harley's point, all these graphs and data is great, but unless you dig down and analyze them and look at other data sources, you're going to need to do that to really get a feel for what interventions you might want to consider or test. And we talked a lot about piloting things in this chat today, which is great, you know, and having that access to instant live data, you can look at piloting certain solutions, having immediate data. Right, so that was my question. What else have we got? We answered a few of these now, haven't we? So we've answered that one. So Harley, one for you. Is air quality in the UK generally improving, or have we got more work to do?
Yes and no to that question. So you're totally right in terms of concentrations of nitrogen dioxide, certainly decreasing. And you've got schemes such as the ULEZ and low traffic neighbourhoods, and just generally the improvement of the vehicle fleet, which is I guess improving that issue. However, on the no side of things, a recent report released by DEFRA has shown that PM 2.5 emissions from domestic sources, including wood burners, has skyrocketed in the past 15 years. And that is a real concern, because you've obviously got wood burners in urban areas, lots of people are exposed for a long period of time. So it's a yes and no. And I did some work during the lockdown which showed that if you have decreases in nitrogen dioxide, other pollutants can increase. And it's not until you also reduce emissions from volatile organic compounds and basically everything that you might get such large decreases, because there's atmospheric chemistry which basically holds nitrogen dioxide levels in place as a result of complex chemistry, because you've got other pollutants which aren't being reduced at the same time. And one important thing to note, I think is really important, is that the perception that air quality is getting better and we're becoming compliant is because we have air quality standards that are potentially too high. So as we're becoming more and more compliant with the air quality standards, we start to look at the WHO standards, which almost none of the UK meets. So Nick said 1% of the world or something meets these standards. So it's if you want to have air quality in line with the standards, yes, it's getting there, but is that enough? That's probably another question.
Thanks, Harley. And while you're still on, I've got a very specific question about salt and sand here. And the question is, have you done any work on determining the contribution of PM burden in coastal areas?
So I've not done any work in terms of monitoring. However, the UK Air Information Resource has a breakdown of background. So it's basically modelled the contribution from, you might have from industry, from cars. So for every grid scale in the UK, there'll be an estimate of what contribution to background level comes from natural resources. I think it bundles together sea salt and other natural causes. So there are other sources there which I can share or answer that question. So yeah, modelled, but not it's not easy to do it for monitored.
Understood. Thanks, Harley. That's great. One for me here. I mentioned defendable data. It was. I think the question's around defendable modelling, but certainly my view is defendable data and the questions around what that means and what project monitoring is. And it's to be honest, it's a relatively new concept that I only came up with for this presentation. I wanted to try and set out compliance monitoring in a different way to other types of monitoring that isn't recognised by government yet. And I was looking at our network across the UK, and almost every one of them is project based. So it is across all those projects that we've talked about: Clean Air Zones, ULEZ. And Harley, you touched on an interesting point on baseline monitoring, and my question for you is how long? I often get this asked by clients: how long do we need data for before we can start to implement a scheme? And I've heard answers ranging from 1 month to 12 months, and then there's never really any consensus. So while we've got you here, what's your view on that sort of optimum level of baseline monitoring? You're probably going to say it depends on the season, but I'll let you answer. Yeah,
so potentially, if you've not got anyone to look into the data after in detail, you're probably going to need to have at least 12 months so you can kind of average out the weird seasonal impacts. If you potentially can do some of the machine learning modeling stuff, you potentially might be able to have a shorter period, because you can kind of get the model to train and account for that sort of variation. But I'm afraid I'm not going to hang my hat on a particular date. And, it could be that you've got to take account of the local factors, and we're half term. There's no point, for example, potentially monitoring in the summer holidays before something.
No, I'm glad you said that. Funny enough, I've got a client who's got 3 months worth of really good data, but it's November, December, January, and obviously it's showing pretty high. Based on the graphs that you showed earlier, that is generally when air quality is poorer in the winter months. Why is that, out of interest?
So there's a number of reasons. More people are in their cars. So you've got a high level of people. Colder air can cause kind of inversions, so it doesn't allow the pollution to escape. They're the main two, and I'm sure I'm forgetting a few more, and I guess people using their heating more, so there's potentially higher background levels. So a combination of people using the cars more, the weather that's trapping pollution to the surface, and just kind of more sources.
Sure, it's certainly the weather affects my school run. It was chucking it down this morning, and I was one of the only people who walked up to school. So yeah, I can absolutely believe that. Right, thanks, Harley. Thanks. Right, questions are still coming in, so please do keep sending them in. Couple on e-cargo bikes, Sarah, if you're still with us.
Of course.
And is there any accepted criteria for usability prior to the loan? And are there any other criteria to prioritize among the local businesses?
So I think what you need to understand is what the businesses are planning to use it for. So what the type of goods are, and therefore what type of cargo bike they need. If they need it with a trailer, but they need 2 wheels, 3 wheels. So I think you'll be understanding the kind of goods and deliveries they're required. In our experience, when we looked into the scheme, businesses weren't jumping up to be the first one as part of the scheme. I think they like to see it as how it progresses, but they're not often willing to be the first ones on the scheme. So I think it's understanding what goods and services are needed, and then getting those e-cargo bikes on the street, and then that's going to be more visible, and then people are going to see how they work, and then it gets to the process of having to prioritize and see which kind of goods and services are most suitable for cargo bikes. I guess if you have a third party running facility, they'll kind of do this for you, and they can prioritize which kind of goods and services and which businesses would be used and prioritized along in that way.
Oh, that's great. I've got another question on safety, but I think you've already answered that. It was around training and highway codes. And it made me think, actually. I was trying to turn right. I was driving, and there was a bike coming up, and it must have been an e-bike because it was traveling at a tremendous pace, and it actually caught me by surprise, uphill as well. So I'm wondering when we get to the point where these are more common on our roads, that the rest of the traffic has to understand how they work and operate. And I'm guessing there's still not very many out there, is there, on the network?
Comparatively, no. The schemes are still kind of in their relative infancy, I think, and they're kind of clustered as well into specific areas, I think. But no, I think compared to all other kind of road users, they're still in their infancy, and they're not loads out there. But as they grow, more and more people are going to have to be aware of them and what they're capable of, and therefore the training needs to kind of combine with that.
Indeed. Right. I got one last question here, and it's I think it's one for you, Harley. It's about ozone, and do you think it's going to be more of an issue as I suppose in sunny conditions, and as NO2 levels going down, as we've talked about, due to the fleet shifting?
Yeah, so the natural experiment, which was the COVID-19 lockdowns, kind of as nitrogen dioxide decreased, ozone levels increased in many places. So just some basic atmospheric chemistry, nitrogen dioxide reacts with ozone and takes it from the atmosphere. So in urban areas where you've got high levels of nitrogen dioxide, you've got generally low levels of ozone. But when you get to the countryside, that role reverses. So yeah, absolutely. And there's a multitude of research which showed that ozone levels decreased in a reduced nitrogen dioxide environment. So yeah, absolutely. And a way that we need to bring down ozone is by also tackling emissions of volatile organic compounds, because it's chemistry that I can't quite wrap my head around, at least over here. There's a strong relationship between nitrogen dioxide, ozone, and volatile organic compounds, and if you can reduce VOCs or volatile organic compound levels as well, it's the best way to bring down levels of ozone as well.
Super, thanks, Harley. And we won't finish on atmospheric chemistry. I'm going to ask Faith one last question and bring it back to sort of the public and simplification. And what is it you think we need to have in place to simplify some of this? Obviously, air quality is massively complex right across the board. How can we best simplify this for the person on the street to make the best decision for them and their family?
That's a big question, I think, isn't it? I think for me, the best way of simplifying it is kind of what Harley touched on with that website or that app that compares things to how many cigarettes. I don't smoke, so I guess I don't know how much harm a cigarette would do, but I know that it's bad. Like, I know smoking is bad for you. So even I can understand that, you know, the same amount of air quality that equates to one cigarette is going to be bad. I think it's putting it in the language that, you know, the average person on the street that doesn't have any knowledge or background in air quality data, you know, would know. Like, just explaining what a measure of NO2 means in a measure of something we can understand, like a cigarette or car exhaust or any other kind of bad contributor. I think that's what we need to be looking at to kind of just make it clearer for people. And then again, just equating it to your actions, you know, like how are the things that you are doing affecting air quality? How are they making it better and worse, and quantifying that in ways that people can understand?
And sorry to give you a second question. What are the actions that we as professionals are encouraging the public to make to sort of reduce their exposure?
I mean, in our industry, it goes down, you know, sort of behaviour change in transport mainly, doesn't it? For I expect most of us on the call. There are obviously sort of actions that you can take across various sectors, but I've got a background in transport, so that's what I know. So yeah, for me, I've worked for the last few years on just trying to encourage more walking and cycling and active travel and less driving. And, you know, we're not saying don't drive, we're just saying maybe think about those shorter journeys that you might drive. Like, can you do them differently? Looking at, yeah, can you use e-cargo bikes, for example, for local delivery? Is if you're a business, do you have to use a car? Or if you do have a vehicle, can you look at alternatives? I know there's lots of arguments for and against electric vehicles, but they are still better in terms of air quality than petrol and diesel. So it's just looking at how we enable behaviour change and help people to make more sustainable choices and be more active, rather than always just resorting to the car. I mean, you know, it's easy and it's convenient, so that's why we do it. But yeah, we shouldn't be as much. So
Thanks, Faith. And I think that's a great point to finish on. Drive less. It's always been my mantra. I am a transport planner. I've been trying to get people to drive less for years, but now we've got some data that we can show them, you know, what actually the impact is of your driving and your idling. Right then, so I think I've answered all the questions there from everyone. Thank you everyone for dialing in this morning. Thanks to Faith, thanks to Sarah, thanks to Harley for some fantastic presentations. As I said, this whole session has been recorded. It will be on the Landor YouTube page, and I'm sure a link will be sent out with all the details. Hope you all have a great Thursday, and I do hope to see you soon on another webinar.